Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. So today I have with me again my good friend Herb Butterworth, and I have been walking my way through Second Peter on the channel, and have just this last video talked about the verses in Second Peter 2 regarding Peter's mention of the flood, and he also does it in chapter 3. I haven't got there yet, but so I figured this was a good um, kind of parenthesis where I can talk to Herb, who's well versed in science um, and as well as scripture. So figured we'd have a conversation and maybe you can benefit from that. So welcome, Herb.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I guess the real focus of our topic will be the the flood in reference to whether, I guess, first of all, whether it actually happened. I think there's evidence for that. You can talk to that. And then also um, the evidence for its global, um, the fact that it's global as opposed to a local flood. So, what do you want to start by talking about evidence or uh, what you want to share regarding just the fact that it happened?
Sure. I think it's one thing that's important to understand is that when we talk about these things, we refer to the Bible a lot and what the Genesis story tells us. But we're not, as some people would accuse us, or many people would accuse us, we're not just clutching on to our Bibles and hanging on to this Genesis story no matter what in the face of all evidence. That's just simply not the case. We're reading what Scripture tells us about the flood and about the story of Noah, and then we look out from that and we see the evidence around us, and we see confirmation that that's happened. Now I know there are many Christians who buy into the idea of old ages, and my point is, the whole point of this is that I think that's unnecessary, and I think that they're going down the wrong path, and I think that they're taking people down the wrong path with them. And it's unfortunate because we do have evidence of a global flood. If we just look around us and we see these uh, massive layers of sedimentary rock that have been deposited worldwide. It's not in a regional area. We see deposits that have been laid over continents. That didn't happen over a long period of time gradually. That had to have been some major catastrophic worldwide event that caused that. And I think just looking at that, it would make you scratch your head and say, how do these get there? How can this be? And I think that's a good place to start.
So, I think what you're referring to is the fact that um, there are, well, obviously massive amounts of water move a lot of earth and rock. And I mean, I live a couple of blocks from the beach, and after a storm, it is amazing. My wife will say, "How do you think that got there?" I said, "The water." I mean, these um, like huge cement. Um, I don't even know what they are, but they're enormous. I mean, they're like the size of a car, and but the water can move that stuff because that certainly wasn't at the beach prior. And we've seen big boulders, and they've had to create a breakwater because the power of the water is such that it was basically eroding the land, and there's a street next to it. So, um, but even that, these enormous granite boulders that they put in and constructed for a breakwater, they get moved in big storms. It's amazing, They get kind of pushed up. So, and that's just kind of at a beach where it's shallow water. I mean, it's when the tide's out, it's like way out because it's not a deep beach. It's just a kind of gradual beach, you know. But and that's inside of I mean, that's Quincy Bay. That's really inside of Boston Harbor, so it's not like you're out in the wide open sea, you know. But so what you're saying is there's evidence of these different kind of sediments, I guess, that are washing across the whole continent, um, which is not going to get there by a trickling river.
Not just the continent, but intercontinental. It goes, they'll go from here to Europe, and it's the same layer. And to say, that was a localized flood, well, that just doesn't make any sense. And I think we can look into it deeper than that even. And like you said, what massive amounts of water can do in a short period of time is simply astounding. But as you also say, we look at the Grand Canyon, and we're told that the Colorado River moving through there over long periods of time caused that canyon to be carved out. But that just it doesn't hold up, because that river, in relation to the canyon itself, it's underfit for that purpose. Huge amounts of material had to be removed from there. Are you telling me the Colorado River moved all that? We see boulders in the river itself, and they're there. And we've seen massive flooding in recent times going through the Colorado River, and that river does not move those boulders. But you look at the material that's been moved out of there. I mean, the Grand Canyon is, I think, in its narrowest part, it's like 4 miles wide and a mile deep. That's an incredible amount of volume that had to be pushed out of there. And that was not the Colorado River that did that, obviously.
Yeah,
So I think
trickling rivers don't cut that.
No, what do they call them? Underfit rivers.
Yeah.
We see, rivers like the Colorado River going through mountains. And as we all know, nobody would disagree that water travels on the path of least resistance. Why in the world would it go through mountains when it could go around them? It doesn't make sense to have a river like that going through mountains, or going from a lower area to a higher area. It doesn't make sense. Something much bigger had to have happened at some point.
Now you're actually you're actually going to be going out there. Is that correct?
Yeah.
You're going to get some great pictures for us and everything.
Well, I hope to. We'll see.
Well, we'll see how good of a photographer you are. Let Betsy do it so it doesn't get messed up.
Well, Betsy's the photographer. She's the one that does all that.
Yeah, that'll be great to get a report after that. But because even in the I've heard you talk about it before, in the layers of the Grand Canyon. Can you describe that? Why that would not be those sedimentary layers that you can see? Why are they not just put down gradually?
Well, they're as we already talked about, they cover huge expanses of territory. No river can do that. Obviously, if we go 200 miles from the Colorado River, we're not going to say that the Colorado River laid this down over time. That's just not going to happen. And when we look at the layers, we see an abrupt end to them. And what we should see, if these were laid down over millions of years, we should see some kind of sign of erosion. We're not seeing that. We're just seeing a smooth surface and a very clear transition from one deposit to the next. Also, over time, there should be some soil development in certain areas. We're not seeing that. We should see some plant growth in there, and that would cause some deterioration in the rock itself. But we're not seeing anything like that. We're not seeing any fossilized roots or anything like that. There's no indication that there was ever any soil deposit there over these millions of years. Just a clear transition from one to another. Another interesting thing, I find this fascinating, is that when you look at these layers, these deposits, you'll see in one layer, you'll see it bent, sometimes up to 90 degrees, you'll see it bent. How in the world is a hard rock going to bend like that? It just can't happen, which is an indication that when these layers were first deposited, they were wet and they folded to the terrain. And the claim that some archaeologists would make, or many archaeologists would make, well, these happen because of the layers on top of those. The pressure over time caused them to heat up. And once they got hot enough, they bent like that. Well, first of all, even if that happened, are you telling me that it bent to a 90-degree angle without breaking? I think that's absurd. And, we were just talking about this before. Is a guy named Andrew Snelling. He's an archaeologist from Answers in Genesis. And he made this observation, and he wondered about it. And he thought, well, surely there's been some chemical analysis done of these rocks, especially where the folds are, to find out if there's any difference in them from this heating that they're claiming to have happened. And he found out there was no research done on that. So he applied for the right to go into the Grand Canyon and get some samples that he could do his own analysis. Well, they gave him a terrible time trying to get in there, and they blocked him, and they told him he couldn't do it. And he went to court, and he was finding that other archaeologists would go in there and they make their application, and they would be granted a right to go in there without any problem at all. And they were getting large samples, much larger than what he wanted, but they blocked him. They just wouldn't do it. And after the court cases, and this went on for some time, finally he got the permission to do it. And what he wanted to do was take an analysis of the rock where the bend took place and compare that to rock further away from that bend in the same deposit up to a mile away, and compare and see what happened, because there should be some change in the rock, some chemical changes in the rock if they were heated like that. And he would compare and see if that in fact did happen. Well, he just came out. There's a video, I'm just telling you about it. There's a video that just came out. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, but I will, in which he gives the results of that analysis. And although I haven't seen it yet, I'm going to be so bold as to say he's going to find that there is no change in the rock where he found the bend as compared to rock taken further away from the bend. I think it's all the same, which is going to be an indication that that was all wet when it was put down. It didn't accumulate over millions of years, as is claimed. And I think that's a very interesting research that he's doing. And
so are you telling me that the educational establishment tried to create a narrative and limit the information that would go out to people so that they would only know one piece of information? You're shocking me.
Hey, listen, I'm not an archaeologist. All I do is I read the evidence.
You don't even play an archaeologist or a geologist on TV?
I'm not even one on TV, no. But what I do is I read both sides very carefully and listen to what they have to say. There was a time 30 years ago where somebody told me that I would believe in Noah's flood exactly as it's portrayed in Genesis at some point in my life. I would have thought they were absolutely nuts. It just, we knew scientifically that just wasn't the case. We knew of billions of years. That was established. Good, hard science behind it. And to my amazement, when I actually looked into it, I thought, well, no, they don't. And what happens is everybody, and I think I can safely say that everybody in this country anyway is taught from a very young age that the earth is 4.5 billion years old, and all of these things develop slowly over time, and we have it ingrained in us. So we look for evidence to suggest that we're true, and any evidence to the contrary is just discarded. And I found that wow, I mean, these young Earth guys, they're right, and they're just being ignored. And it's the problem with Noah's flood. It's been made to appear so parochial that to believe in it means that you're just foolish. And you see the pictures of Noah's Ark with the giraffe smiling with his neck sticking way up and all that. That's how it's sort of portrayed. That's your mentality if you believe in such a thing. And people are afraid to step up and say, no, the evidence is not pointing towards that. This is we've got it established, and we have radiometric dating that proves that the Earth is old, and we know that these layers have been laid down slowly over time. And yes, the Colorado River carved out the Grand Canyon, and they just accept that. And there's a fear to not accept that, because the truth of the matter is, any archaeologist who looks at the evidence and comes away with that conclusion, they're just pushed aside. They're just going to be just devastated. It's career ending, is what it is.
So, Herb, before we get into other aspects, you mentioned dating. Can you explain the difference in what would happen regarding the dating methods if there was or was not a flood?
Well, radiometric dating, it's a wonderful idea. And if everything were just perfect conditions, it would be great. As far as I know, everything would just work out fine. The problem with it is, well, what it is, it's based on, I don't want to get too much into this, but it's based on half-lives. Like a good example would be carbon-14, which can't be used for long periods of time. But one that is potassium argon. And potassium has a half-life. It's a long period of time. It's like 2.5 billion years or something like that. And over time, potassium will break down, goes through a process where it breaks down into different chemicals and eventually ends up as argon. So if you start out with a rock and it has a great majority of potassium and very little argon, you would say that that rock is young. Well, over time, the argon will build up. And if we have a lot of argon in a rock, the ratio is right. We'd say, well, that's an old rock. And we would say it's so many years old depending on the ratio of potassium to argon. So in theory, that's a great way of doing it. The problem is that we don't have a consistent rate. Something throws it off. And if we test that with known, like a lava flow, we know when that lava flow happened, the rock was reset because it was heated to a molten state. And we know that that's new rock. Because when it's heated like that, all the argon is released into the atmosphere. So it's a reset, so to speak.
Yep.
So we would, a known age of that rock, and it's tested with these methods, and we get wildly different ages of that rock. One that I commonly mention is there was a lava flow in Hawaii, I believe in the 1870s. And using this method, it's dated to be like 1.5 to 5 million years old, something like that. But we know it's less than 200 years. So, and we do that time and time again in other areas, Mount St. Helens for one. And we get these wildly different dates. So based on that, I think it's safe to say that these are very unreliable methods. One of the interesting things is when you look at these rocks, you can find inside of them what's called a radio halo. Radio halos should not form unless the process was speeded up many, many times. It says the radiation is being released at such a fast rate that these halos are created in the rocks. And you can see that, and you know that over a period of time, if the radiation was being released at what was expected, you wouldn't see any of this. But that's an indication to us that there was a catastrophic event at one time where the process was speeded up. And thus, if it's speeded up, we're going to get an age that's much greater than what we would expect to have. So because of that, I think we can safely draw the conclusion that these are not reliable sources of aging.
So, so they're not reliable, which would answer to, um, a, a global catastrophe.
Oh, I think absolutely there was a global catastrophe. We have a lot of indications that that was such. We see that in the layers, like we already talked about, the smoothness in between the transitions. That doesn't make any sense in a long period of time. As far as radiometric dating goes, I'm sure you've heard the stories of carbon-14 dating being done on a mammoth, and they found that the front part of the mammoth was, say, 30,000 years old, and the rear part of the mammoth was 6 million years old. Same animal, same method.
Wow, he took a while to grow, huh?
yeah, or a long time to be born.
Yeah. He grew back to front over millions of years.
So I think it's safe to say we can discard that. The theory is wonderful. If it worked
conceptually, right?
But it's a great idea.
But you'd have to have not only, um, you'd not only have to be able to go any place in the world and establish the same standardized rates, right, everywhere. It have to be consistent in order to be reliable, but also, isn't there certain assumptions made with the amount of, you're talking about radioactivity in some of these, the amount that is released over time? Don't you have to make an assumption of where you start?
You do have to make an assumption. You have to make an assumption that that rock was set at 0 argon, all potassium, that you would not detect any argon in it at all. And that's very unlikely that would happen. It's like,
well, the Earth, the Earth is hot, right? At its core.
The core is hot.
So, if I was an atheistic evolutionist, and I thought that somehow the Earth just kind of, ended up there from the Big Bang or whatever, it would be hot, right? I mean, it would have to be at some point to form in a globe, right?
Yeah, and we have to, this goes into the event itself, the catastrophic event that took place. This wasn't, when we refer to Noah's flood, we're not talking about waters gradually rising and being still and just rising and covering the earth and then receding and going back down. This was a catastrophic event. The deep open up.
The entire topography would change. But my question is, I guess, if the Earth had to have formed, because it is, right? So if it formed with heat, which it would have to, because it's not like you can kind of crunch it all together like a snowball, then how could you possibly assume the amount of argon anywhere?
You can't. You've heard the analogy. I'm sure you've heard something like this. It's like you go into a room and you see a candle burning, and your job is to find out how long has that candle been burning. Well, you sit there for an hour and you took a measurement of how tall that candle was at the time that you entered the room. And then you watched it burn for an hour and you did another measurement. Maybe it burned an inch. Well, how do you know how tall that candle was to begin with? And how do you know, well, was some of the candle already burnt? So you have no idea. You don't. You're just assuming that you might look at another candle and say, well, this candle is 8 inches tall. So I'm going to assume it was 8 inches tall. You don't know that.
Right.
Might have been, 6 inches tall. It might have been, 4 inches or whatever it was. You don't know. You're making an assumption based on something else. So when you do radiometric dating, you're kind of doing that. You're walking into the room and you don't know what the starting point was.
Well, it's interesting. I do that with kids in class when I go through some of this. I say, I use the hourglass. So
Yeah,
I say, okay, you guys just walked in the room. I said, there's an hourglass on the desk, and half the sand is at the bottom. I said, how long has it been tipped over? And most of them will say, well, like half an hour.
yeah,
I said, well, I just tipped it over before you walked in. Because again, the
yeah.
assumption is it was all the sand was on the top, and so that's where you started. But
Right.
so now if we throw the flood into the mix, the earth being whether God created it or came from nowhere, right? It still would have to have some aspect of heat connected with its forming, correct?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
so you not only have to assume the amount of argon in the conversation we're having now, anyways, the amount of argon in the rock, which you can't, but then now you add a global catastrophe into it. I would think that would also, because it affected the topography of the whole planet, that would also affect dating methods, no?
Sure it would. Yeah. You think, all that water, for one thing, is tremendous pressure, and that's going to make changes. There's all kinds of factors in this. What they're talking about is a rock sitting in a lab, the
Right.
same temperature. That's what they're talking about. And they're trying to use this out in the real world. And that it just doesn't apply there. We don't know what's happening. We don't know what happened in the past. We don't know what there was that changed rates. And we see evidence of this. And I'm kind of interested in why they hang on to these things when as we talked about, we have the known age of certain things and we can't even get the dates right on that. Do you know one of the questions is when you send in a sample to be aged and they use these techniques, they ask you, what do you think the age is?
Which should
Why
have
would
no
they do?
which should have no bearing on anything.
No, no, you should just send it in and they date it and that's it. But why would they ask such a thing? I don't know. It's just, to
I guess
me,
I guess to determine whether they're going to give you your PhD.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not a viable method of doing this, and unfortunately, we don't have a real methodology of dating things. We just don't. But that gives them they find that they can get long ages with this, which is what they want, so they use it.
Yeah,
You've heard
it supports their
there's
theory.
many more evidences for a young Earth than there are for an old Earth, but yet they just hang on to the ones that give an old Earth. And even though they're unreliable, they'll hang on to that and just discard everything that would suggest a young Earth.
So let's use that as a segue because obviously, from a scientific standpoint, we haven't even mentioned the Bible yet. So, from a scientific standpoint, um, there really is certainly no concrete evidence, and there doesn't even seem to be any reasonable evidence that we can discover uh, the age of the Earth from that, from whatever scientific measurements that they can actually do. And the things that we would look at, and we've talked about this in other videos, the things that they would look at to determine the age of the Earth that we know about, magnetism, the measurement for that, and nickel and salt in the ocean, all that. That tells us that we haven't been here that long. So that all speaks to a younger Earth. So there's if we were to line up all the criteria for for what we do know, um, the vast majority of the um, of that list would fall on the side of a young Earth. I actually don't know really much that would fall to the old Earth. I think the only thing that they would have would be the speed of light out in in the universe, and that's and that has problems on both sides. So if you were to just kind of table that for now, because we just don't really understand it enough, and there's too many assumptions from both sides, then if we just measure what we do have on the Earth, we're talking about a young Earth, correct?
I would say so. Yeah, one of the things that I can't, I've been looking into it for quite some time now. But yeah, the speed of light is one of the things, but that's negated by the cosmic background radiation. They have the same problem on an old Earth.
Right.
It's just they kind of negate each other. So whatever the solution is for one is probably the solution for the other.
Right.
So I don't know. There's all kinds of theories that are thrown out there for both things, but
Well, that's why I say, let's take the distant starlight issue and just kind of push it aside for now, because
yeah,
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 because neither side has certainly neither side has an absolute answer. There's speculation on both sides, but um, like you say, with the Big Bang, the there's really not enough time, which is why they add inflation into the mix, because again, an assumption that that's kind of how it worked, and I mean, obviously from a biblical standpoint, God didn't need to start, like he didn't need to create a singularity to blow it up, right?
yeah,
I mean, when you speak things into existence, um, when Jesus healed people, um, he didn't have to start with a cell and wait for it to kind of develop. I mean, it happened in an instant. Do you know what I mean?
yeah.
Um,
I do. It's interesting how you mentioned inflation, and their solution to the problem is to come up with inflation, a short period of time where the universe expanded like you know astronomically in a short period of time. There's no reason to believe that other than that solves their problem. Now, if we were to come up with something like that for light speed and why we see distant stars the way that we do, they would accuse us of God of the gaps. And so those silly
which is
people,
what they're doing, right?
which is what they're doing, but that seems to be fine.
They have inflation at the gaps.
Yeah, inflation of the gaps.
So
Yeah,
so the reason that it's important for us to even go down this road is because there's no scientific evidence um, to dismiss the flood, and there's all the scientific evidence that we would expect to see if there was a flood. Now, as we kind of segue over into the Bible and into more of a Christian context, um, I guess the thing that, and we've talked about this, that's bothersome to us is that there are Christians that are, in the science community that, you know, hold to a local flood. And I think that that creates terrible problems with the Bible itself. I don't, I mean, it's unsupportable biblically. As I've been going through Second Peter, last week in chapter 2, it talked about, let's see, in verse 5 of chapter 2, it says, and God didn't spare the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly, right? So, um, if it was a localized flood, then there's problems with that, because like Noah, God's saying only 8 people survived the flood. So if he's only talking in a region, then um, then God didn't actually judge the world; He judged a region. Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
And Genesis 7 and 8, as you walk through those chapters, and they talk about the specifics of the flood. I mean, all the language is global. The word all is mentioned a number of times. Um, and I think all typically means all, but
And that's all it is.
yeah, and after God shut Noah in the ark and his kids and their wives, it says, you know, it the phrase um, the earth. Let's see, one, two, three, four, five, six. So it's mentioned six times in one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, six times in 9 verses. Leading up to the end of chapter 7. And, it says in verse 23, and every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man, cattle, creeping things, fowl in the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark, right? But then, obviously it goes into chapter 8 where it talks about, um, as the water receded. But you had actually started to mention it earlier. The water came from actually 3 locations. It wasn't just rain. It was also the windows of heaven, which I believe was probably some kind of water canopy or global, you know, canopy of water around there when God separated the waters from below and above, right? On the second day, and then the fountains of the deep, right? Those oceanic caverns that are under the continents that opened up and brought forth water. So, do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The fountains of the deep opened up, and I know people used to say quite often how there's not that much water on the earth to flood it to biblical proportions. And isn't it interesting? In more recent years, they have found that there is more water below the Earth's surface than there is in all the oceans that are out there now. That's a lot of water.
Yeah, that is a lot.
And when the deep opened up, that was a lot of water that came out there. Also, I don't think that according to the Bible and what happened in the catastrophic event, the mountains that we see today were not like they are. They weren't like they are now. I think there was a lot of plate tectonics, a lot of movement of land masses that caused that, and all of the rising. And an indication that we have of that is, this is something to me that's just fascinating. We find whale fossils in the Himalayas. Well, how in the world did that happen? And we find sea fossils all over the world in high places and in deserts, and
Yeah, most of
it's
them
quite
are up on the continent.
yeah, yeah. It's fascinating to me. How could this be?
How could it be?
Yeah, yeah.
So, so the and I think the reason that this is so bothersome when Christians advocate a local flood, I think the, it's my own opinion. The reason that they're doing it is because um, they're they're trying to align with obviously with the old Earth theory, and then they can't have a global flood with an old Earth theory. I think there's two, though there are old Earthers that believe in a global flood, but I think it creates too many problems. I think it creates scientific problems. Um, it answers the biblical issue. In other words, they realize that the Bible teaches a global flood, and so they stick with that. But then, in siding with the scientific community that would disagree, do you know what I mean? Like you end up with all these conflicts. It's like saying, um, so we got kind of half the Christian world that says it was a global flood, and half that it wasn't. And in some of the global flood, um, they're saying, well, yeah, I see it as a global flood, but yet I believe in an old Earth, and yet you almost can't really determine that the Earth was that old unless you're in the other camp. because you have to make all these assumptions that you can rely on. When if it was a global flood, you can't rely on those dating methods. They're just not going to be consistent.
Yeah, well, one of the problems is that, if you believe in a regional flood, which a lot of Christians do, well, doesn't that make God a liar? Because after the flood, he promised he would never flood the earth again. And if it was just a regional flood that he was referring to, well, certainly we've had many regional floods.
Yeah, he's
So he
gone
went
against.
back on
Yeah,
his word.
yeah,
Yeah.
he's broken
And
his
I think
promise.
that's, yeah, yeah. How can we trust this guy? He told us he wouldn't do it, and then he did. I think that's a real problem for those people. And the thing, I really want to emphasize this. When you look at the Genesis account of a global flood, a worldwide flood, you would expect to go out there and see certain things. And those things that we would expect to see, we do see. So I don't understand why any Christian would shy away from this unless they're afraid of rejection from the world. That's the only reason I can see it, because there is no good basis to not believe this.
Hey,
It's just
mention the thing that we were talking about yesterday. We had watched that video of that debate between the guy that was the Christian and then the guy that supposedly used to be a Christian.
Scott. I think that
mention what the guy that's an atheist now that used to be a Christian or a pastor or whatever he was. Um, he actually understood the whole issue better than most Christians, as far as I'm concerned. Though he then says, "Well, we just don't consider any of that as atheists." It's like, but that's the information, you know. It's like going on it would be like going to a crime scene as a detective, and you see, tables overturned, gunshot wounds, bullet holes in the walls, and everything, and then him saying, "Yeah, we're not concerned about any of that." But that's the evidence. You know what I mean? Yeah, we're just going to ignore that. We'll find a guy we think is guilty of the murder.
Well, the problem with these things, and I think that video that we watched was a good example of this. When you have these old earthers that are Christians, and I don't question their salvation.
No,
I
it's
think
not a salvation issue.
No, it's not. But they get on board with this kind of stuff, and I'm going to put words in their mouths. I think what they're thinking is that we have a problem in Christianity today, that we're seeing a falling away. And I think it's a shame. And they think by adopting these old earth philosophies, that they're making it easier for young people to come into Christianity by not disagreeing with the world, or going to school and not disagreeing with their professors, and that old earth is true, and they buy into this thing, and it makes it easier for them to be a Christian and get along, so to speak. The problem is, like when we saw with that guy yesterday, I think his name was Bill, I can't remember his last name, but he's an atheist. He was a Christian previously. The problem he had is that when he looked at the things in the Bible, like what we were talking about, he would see a worldwide flood, and some people calling it regional, and he probably went along with the regional, and then God went back on his word. And we see regional floods all the time, so that can't be true. And the inconsistencies with what they say, like with evolution, and this is a big one, and I don't mean to get off topic, but it's like this. If evolution is true, and we've been around for millions and millions of years, well, there was death and disease and sin well before the fall. If that's true, then what the Bible tells us is that sin and death entered the world through sin and our fall. Well, then we can't trust that, because obviously sin and death came before the fall. And that makes people say, well, wait a minute, this isn't true. And if I can't believe that, what part of the Bible can I believe and what part can I believe? It just becomes, everything can be pushed aside. And then for Bill's an intelligent guy. I have no doubt about that. But he thinks through these things like that and says, "Well, this is just a bunch of nonsense." And you know what? He's right. If that were true, he would be right. But it's not true. And these guys, when they cave in like that or just bend to the will of the masses, that's what they're doing. And a guy like Bill, who was a Christian, he falls away.
Well,
And
he
I think
can.
that's what ultimately what will happen.
Well, because he can see through. I think that I think that once you compromise, the dominoes start to fall, and
Yeah,
it's a few years back. Um, I think it was the Wycliffe Bible translators. There was some kind of split that happened in them because the Bibles that were being translated and sent over to the Middle East in Farsi, um, you know, there's um, there's a compromise in the translation. In other words, if you're a Muslim, um, you know, um, the idea that God is your father, that Jesus is the Son of God, there's certain things within Islam that are a no-no. Okay, and so what they did was they were translating the Bible and taking those phrases and those words out so as not to stumble Muslims so they could read the Bible. But the problem is they even were putting not Jesus in, but the name that the Muslims use for Jesus. They were replacing Jesus' name with that. Again, with the same idea that we'll kind of soft sell this and not challenge you, because if we challenge you too much, you may not come to Christ. Well, the problem is they're getting people to believe in a Jesus that's different than the Jesus in the Bible.
yeah.
It's the Muslim Jesus that it, the Muslim Jesus can't save anybody. Do you know what I mean?
I
It's
know
like
exactly what you.
yeah, it's like the Jehovah Witness Jesus, the Mormon Jesus, the Christian Science Jesus, all these other Jesuses. Um, they can't save anybody, and so um, in in accommodating that, and there are Christians that you know they believe in what's called Chrislam. You blend Christianity and Islam together, which is really an abomination. But they do that in order to try to reach Muslims. But what they're doing is is no different than what a lot of the liberal church has done in trying to diminish the effects of the gospel because they want to reach out to people to save them, but yet they're not really saving them from anything. They're just doing something to accommodate them, and they're bending Christianity um, so that it's acceptable for people to live the way they want to live, believe what they want to believe, and then they can still call themselves Christians, which are not Christians at all.
I agree with you. It's a shame that some of these guys are they're brilliant and they have wonderful testimony. They have so much to offer. I mean, William Lane Craig with his Kalam cosmological argument, I think he's wonderful, and he adds so much. And John Lennox, I have a world of respect for him, but he believes in old ages as William Lane Craig does. And one of the things that frustrates me about these guys is, okay, you guys are very intelligent. You understand the scriptures. You understand many things that I don't understand. All I'm asking from you is give me what it is that convinced you in an old earth. What is it that you accept this? I don't have anything, Scott. Well, the evidence would suggest. What evidence? Have you heard anything? Have you heard them say anything? This is what convinced me.
No,
I
because it's interesting. I know William Lane Craig has some really strange theories about Adam, and his latest book deals with that. But once you get into these old ages, then you not only have to compromise Genesis 1, and kind of mythologize it in some fashion or allegorize it. But then it's like, well, what do you do with Adam? I mean, is he actually, were Adam and Eve real people? Were they just kind of an idea? You know, um, just the kind of typological, mythological couple that kind of were the first humanoids in the process of evolution. No, well, because nobody knows what to do with them, and everybody has kind of their own view. Because once you let it go, it goes anywhere. And um, I find it interesting that the guys that try to hold um, to a literal Adam and Eve, um, and I appreciate the fact that they do, but then the problem is they have to add time prior to Adam and Eve. And so they're stretching days, which again, they stretch the days in order to try to um, add time in there, but in trying to be scientific, you can't really stretch the days and maintain like any kind of scientific integrity, okay? Because you can't have all that vegetation for millions of years, but yet you have like no means of supporting it, okay? Because they say the sun came out on day 4, and it's like, well, what did it have prior? Right? Well, the sun was there, but it didn't shine through the clouds. Okay, so how'd the vegetation survive? In other words, you end up getting into all these kind of scientific problems. And then they get back, and then some of them have said, well, there's a gap between, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, gap, and then whatever time you need, which now they're falling back to the old Thomas Chalmers made popular gap theory, which he made that popular to add geological ages in. And then when he did that, it was like, well, where did all the fossils come from in those geologic ages that were in the gap? Well, that was a different race. Oh, well, were those people saved or not? No, they had no souls. And it's like you have a whole developed storyline from no evidence, from like zero. And
Yeah.
this is part of the problem. So if there's a great book by Weston Fields called Unformed and Unfilled, where he goes through the detail and the Hebrew and the grammar and everything that really shows you that the gap theory can't really work grammatically with Genesis 1. But to not go down that road at this point, the point that I'm trying to make is that once you start to compromise, you'll buy into whatever viewpoint will support your view. But now we're back kind of thinking like atheistic evolutionists that, hey, anything I can find to support evolution, I'll support, even though it may not make any sense or it may be crazy. But hey, if it supports what I want to be true, then I'll just kind of grab onto it. And I think that, to your point, as many of the very able Christians that are out there in the apologetics community and everything else like you're talking about, I think they do a disservice because they're kind of sawing the branch off that they're standing on to try to lengthen the time, because there are problems with that. And I agree with you. I think that they feel, well, if we start talking young Earth, we'll be dismissed right away, and then we're done. Like, we can't talk to anybody. But I look at it from a different standpoint. When I go through and I teach these high school Bible classes in apologetics, I tell them, if you're talking to somebody that's an atheist and you're dealing with the cosmological argument, the issue is not when the universe was created. The issue is that it was created. So we're not teaching creationism. If you're talking to an atheist, you're not talking creationism. You're not talking a young Earth or an old Earth. The time element is of no value. The issue is that time began. So whether it began 6 to 10,000 years ago, or 14 billion years ago, that's not the issue. The issue is it had a starting place, and that means that it began, right, correlative to matter and space, and then somebody had to do that. It doesn't Things don't make themselves that don't exist. So you need an agent. The agent has to be beyond time, space, and matter. And you know we're going from effect back to cause, and obviously you have to have a being that ultimately, when he's described, the characteristics and the nature of this being necessitate that we assign them certain qualities that they would have to have to create the universe. Well, you're really describing the biblical God. Um, so I guess my point is that I've talked to a number of atheists. I don't have to get into how old the universe is. That's not the issue. The issue isn't how the universe began. The issue is that it began. And I think that once you get into kind of educating on the time element, um, you're already kind of chiseling away at your own foundation. Do you follow what I'm saying?
I do follow you, and I think ultimately what you're saying is we have to come to an uncaused cause. That has to be, and time did have to begin. It can't be like Roger Penrose talks about the what's the term he uses? It's a bouncing universe. It
Oh, oh,
expands a
the oscillating universe. Yeah.
oscillating universe, and well, how did that begin? How could that have begun? And if we look at it as time is infinite, that it just keeps going back and back and back. Well, the argument is that if that were so, we never could have arrived at this moment.
No.
We couldn't, because we just keep going back and back and back. There's always a day before, an hour before. You couldn't arrive at this time. So time logically had to have begun at some point. There is no way, if you use logic and you think through these, I don't mean to get off the topic here, but using logic, you have to conclude that there is an uncaused cause of all causes, and that has to be God, because that cause had to be immaterial and highly intelligent and exist outside of time and space. It has to be. There's no other way around it.
Yeah,
They come up with all kinds of
you'd have to have an infinite being.
yes, yes. There's no way around it. There's
Yeah.
just no way. They try and they try and they come up with some pretty fascinating ideas. And my hat's off to them. They're pretty creative, but nothing logical to conclude. It's
So
just
so let's finish off here with Peter says in Second Peter 3, um, talking about these scoffers that come in the last days. In verse 4, he said they'll be saying, "Where's the promise of his coming?" Talking about Christ, mocking the second coming. For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. In other words, the start of everything. For this, they, in other words, these scoffers, are willingly ignorant of, that the word of God, that by the word of God, in other words, God speaking, like it says in Psalm 33, by the word of God, the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water. In other words, he's talking about a global creation. He's not just talking about like something regional, right? Because he goes on, he says, whereby the world that then was being overflowed with water perished. Well, the world, he's talking global. He says, because the heavens and the earth, which are now, in other words, in contrast to the other, by the same word are kept in store, reserved under fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men, right? Um, and then he starts talking about the coming of Christ and the day of the Lord and everything. I mean, Jesus isn't just coming regionally. I mean, this is a global event, and where Peter mentions, because he knows the word, right? Where Peter mentions, let me just flip to it real quick, where he mentions the world by the word of God then was. in Psalm 33, verse 4, it says, "For the word of the Lord," let's see, all right. "For the word of the Lord is right, and all his works are done in truth. He loves righteousness and judgment. The earth is full of the goodness of the Lord." Verse 6, "By the word of the Lord," basically Jehovah, "were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth." In other words, he spake, right? He gathered the waters of the sea together as a heap, like basically a dam. He lays up the depth in storehouses, talking about the depth of the ocean. "Let all the earth," this is global, right? "Fear Jehovah. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him," not just regional people. Verse 9, "For," this is the conclusion, "for he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast," right? So interesting, in verse 6 it says, "Jehovah brings the counsel of the Gentiles to nothing. He makes the devices of the people of no effect. But the counsel of the Lord stands forever, and the thoughts of his heart to all generations," right? Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, right? So obviously Peter is referencing back to Psalm 33 because it's talking about God started everything by speaking, but that's what you get in Genesis. "And the Lord said, and the Lord said, and the Lord said." So these things just appeared. I mean, I think that even when I think about Jesus' miracles, and when he would just speak and people get healed, um, like God has the capability of just like it just happens when he says it. You know what I mean? So there's no difficulty. You know, Chuck used to say, you know, when you're dealing with God, any thought of difficulty in reference to God is an absurdity because you have to assign um, whatever measure of difficulty based on the agent doing the work. Well, if the agent's God, then obviously difficulty goes out the window because his capability to do anything. So the reason that I'm bringing 2 Peter 3 into it, because Peter is telling us basically after everything, and his writing is near the end of the Bible, but everything prior, that he's concluding that the end, there is like there's going to be a worldwide effect in God judging the earth, the whole thing, not just a region, and he is making the direct correlation to creation and how God judged the world in the flood. And like you said, you know, there's been many regional floods, and it's silly anyways. Noah could have moved. Like, you know, he had 120 years to build the ark. It's like, you know, he could have gone to the other side of the planet. He wouldn't have had to stay there. You know, that's silly. So there's just so many problems with it, and I think that, you know, I think that, it, you know, look, Herb, the thing that we do and that we're trying to do is we're trying to look at the Bible consistently. We're not trying to be ignorant of what is outside the Bible. However, if I'm looking at what the Bible's teaching me, and then I look outside the Bible, and what's outside the Bible is consistent with what I'm reading, like, why would I change that? I mean, the only reason I would ever change my view or say, well, I know, you know, I know the Bible seems to indicate here that and says that we have a global flood, but that's not going to work with the kind of scientific view that I hold. So, well, we'll just call it a regional view. And then it's like, well, since it's a regional view, you know, we'll separate the effects of sin in the world. We'll have sin in the world and death prior to Adam, and we'll just have Adam's sin just affecting people, right? Won't affect anything else. Well, the whole ground was cursed because of Adam's sin, right? I mean, it was beyond just the death of people. the earth itself, the ground was cursed. It's part of the curse. And so it affected animals and everything else. And we've talked about how Romans 8, um, in the ultimate glorification aspect of humanity in Christ, um, you know, uh, all creation groans. That's everything, and then the animals and the die and everything are part of that. But their the resolution of their problem of groaning and death and everything else is resolved and correlates to the redemption of man because the curse is now reversed. Do you follow what I mean? So
I do.
so in that sense, we watched that debate some time ago. Remember, it was between it was Hugh Ross and um, oh, I can't think of his name right now, but begins with a K. But so they were on the one side, and then Ken Ham and um, um, I can. I'm having a senior moment. I can see the other guy. Remember, they were debating the age of the Earth and all stuff. And Hugh Ross and
Was it Jason Lyle?
yeah, Jason Lyle and Ken Ham on one
Yeah.
side, Hugh Ross
Yeah.
and I mean, I got the other guy that was with Ross. He's theologian. I have his books. The hard sayings of Jesus, the hard sayings of Paul, and all that stuff. And and again, good theologian and everything, but they took the position that there was basically death in the world and everything prior to Adam, but because they have to, you can't maintain an old Earth view without that occurring. I mean, it's just not possible. How could you? Because the dating method that you use is the fossil layers, and the fossil layers have nothing but dead things in them. So if they're existing prior to Adam and his sin, then you have death and sin in the world, right? And because they're dead, the fossils, they're dead. So it's like, well, how do we fix that? And then now you're on this rabbit trail of trying to resolve Pandora's box, which I don't. There's no biblical resolution to it, and I think it makes Christians appear to be as illogical and compromising as possible. Look, I would rather have somebody say, "Hey, listen, I believe this because the Bible says it, and I don't see anything in the world that contradicts it." All right. Um, you don't have to be a genius to understand the Bible, and I don't think you have to be a genius to understand some of these concepts that we read about and everything in the scientific community. I'm certainly no scientist, but I'm not an idiot either. So, um, if I was looking at Christians and they were saying, "Hey, this is what we believe. The Bible teaches this, and that's our position, and we don't see a reason, scientifically or otherwise, to see anything different from that." Whether I agreed with them or not, at least I appreciate their conviction to it. The problem is that what I want to kind of join that group, if they all had so many different opinions and argued with each other, and then it's like, well, then what, like, so how do they even know if it's true? That's where the problem comes in, and I think this lack of consistency among Christians, to your point earlier, it's not helping, um, because what they're doing is they're allowing the world to maintain their own views, which are built on a false premise, and then they're trying to kind of squeeze some of the Christianity into it. And I think it there's a people start reading the Bible and they go, yeah, that can't be true, and so they start assigning their own viewpoints to whether it's creation or anything else. And you know what? if he can change creation, if that doesn't actually mean what it means in Genesis 1, well, how do we know that anything in the Bible, including the resurrection, um, what happened with the New Testament and all that? Well, how do we know any? Maybe they're not really miracles. Maybe they're just kind of fabricated stories that why? In other words, why should we actually believe those eyewitnesses? You follow what I mean? In other words, the
Yeah,
dominoes just start kind of collapsing down. I
yeah.
think it, I think it's dangerous personally, but that's my
Oh,
story, and I'm sticking to it.
I don't think, I don't think there's any way around it, Scott. I think what I would like to say in conclusion is, as far as a global flood is concerned and the evidence that we have, I do believe that if we took a rational person, your average rational person who had no biblical knowledge and had no knowledge of modern geology, and you just took them out there to look around various things, and you presented them with the two options that these layers they formed over millions of years, or the other theory is that these were laid down rapidly by a global flood. I think that without having any presuppositions or being taught anything previously, I think that the rational person would come away with, I think the flood story is more viable. I really do believe that. And as you pointed out, we're not clutching onto our Bibles. We're not sticking our fingers in our ears and saying, la, la, la. We're looking at what is around us, the evidence that is around us. And then we look at what the Bible says and we say, that's amazing. What we're seeing is what the Bible has told us. That's what we get. And for people to say there's no evidence of a flood or a global flood, that's an outrageous statement. It's all around us,
Yeah.
all around us. And that's what it comes down to.
Well, I think that's a good place to end, anyways. And
Yeah.
listen, we hope that you guys that have stayed with us. I know we're an hour and 12 minutes, but if you stayed with us, we appreciate it. Um, Maybe it's given you something to think about, um, you know, depending upon what side of this issue you fall on. But until next week, then, like I say all the time, may God richly bless you as you continue to study